afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second external webinar for the 2021 Spring Hydrologic Outlook. Today's briefing will be a general overview and update of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Greater Mississippi, Souris River, Red River of the North, and Great Lakes basins. Today's presenters are myself, Katie Ertel, a hydrometeorologist at the National Water Center, and the Service Coordination Hydrologist or Senior Hydrologist from the 5 river forecast centers in the Greater Mississippi River Basin. Jim Knoll from Ohio Basin River Forecast Center, Mike Welvert from the North Central River Forecast Center, Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, James Paul from Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center, and Jeff Grashel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. This webinar is being recorded and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how you can access that recording. Should you have a question during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into the question mark that you'll see on the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will address it at the conclusion of the presentations. Let's start out this afternoon by taking a look at the winter precipitation so far across the Greater Mississippi Basin and how it compares to last year. Overall, still a big difference between this year, as you can see in that center graphic, and last year in that graphic on the right. This year, below normal precipitation can be seen across most of the Greater Mississippi Basin, but portions of the Central Plains are now slightly above average for the season. Since the last webinar 2 weeks ago, a dry trend has continued in the upper and middle portions of the Mississippi Basin, which you can see in that graphic on the left, which I have circled in red. But portions of the lower Mississippi Valley have seen above average that I have. In the graph, and looking at the past 2 weeks, you can see the effects of a very cold blast of Arctic air, which brought record low temperatures to much of the basin. This cold blast resulted in an increase of ice development along many rivers, which had remained mostly ice-free as temperatures moderate in the coming weeks, which the river forecast centers will touch on later in the presentation. As expected, these cold weeks also brought our seasonal average temperatures across the basin to below normal, which you can see in that middle graphic there. So time last year, seen in the graphic on the right, where temperatures were above average across the entire basin. Moving on to the next slide, if you take a look at the graphic on the left, which is displaying the snowfall percent of mean from the last 2 weeks. The difference from the last webinar is that we now have more pockets of above average snowfall accumulation, particularly in the lower Mississippi and into the Ohio Valley. So a good portion of the snow has already melted or is forecast to melt within the week. So Jim Knoll from the Ohio River Forecast Center will dive deeper into that here shortly. Elsewhere, you can see that that Arctic air that I mentioned on the last slide also brought much above average snowfall to the southern plains and into the mid to lower Mississippi Valley for that time period. I do note though, especially in the lower Mississippi, that snow has melted. So this overall caused a seasonal percent of mean seen in that middle graphic to rise across the region as well. So pretty different from last year here, as you can see in the graphic on the right, where the southern portions were without snow, and the northern portions had more. Moving on to this next slide and looking at the snow water content this year versus last year, the primary difference compared to last year is that we have a lot less snow water content across the upper Mississippi Valley. However, you can see in that circled area there in the Midwest and into the northern Ohio River Basin, we do continue to see higher amounts of snow water content this year compared to last year. Now looking at the soil moisture across the basin, a big change from last year. We're starting to see some pockets of elevated soil moisture content mixed into the basin there, especially in areas where recent snowmelt has been observed. But all in all, it's a much different story, especially across the upper Mississippi Valley where soils were saturated last year, and this year saturations are near normal and even much below normal across North Dakota and South Dakota there, which just speaks to how dry it's been there. This shows up well. We take a look at the U.S. Drought Monitor here on the next slide. This was released this morning and is showing that moderate to severe drought that I mentioned in the northern and central plains is still present. So a very different situation from last year at this time, which you can see in that lower left-hand corner on this slide, where virtually no drought existed across the Mississippi Basin. Taking a look at the USGS 7-day stream flows, most of the Mississippi Basin is experiencing near normal stream flow, seen in the green colors on this map. Right now, the Ohio Valley stream flows are below normal on this 7-day graphic, and that's because most precipitation has fallen as snow, meaning water is still held up in the snowpack there. This, as I alluded to, is expected to change as temperatures continue to moderate, and the snowpack releases that water. So you'll notice the white sections also in the upper Midwest and Northern Plains. That's where we're iced in or where seasonal gauges are not taking measurements. But you do see some greens and blues mixed in there, indicating that where there is flow, it is above normal to normal there. Across the central portion of the basin here, some isolated areas of below normal stream flow are now in place. So that's quite a change from 2 weeks ago, where stream flows were normal in the central plains there. These generally normal to slightly below normal flows are also a bit of a change from last year, as you can see in that graphic on the right, where most stream flows across the Mississippi Basin, especially in the lower Mississippi, were above normal. These stream flows, in consideration with the soils that are drier than last year across the basin, do suggest that overall the basin has more capacity for springtime rain, which could help to mitigate some of that flood threat into the spring. This next slide is showing the amount of flood storage available from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers within the Mississippi River Basin. So still plenty of room flood storage wise right now. The biggest change that we're seeing here from the last webinar 2 weeks ago is that the Yazoo River in Mississippi has a little less storage capacity after several rainfall events traversed that region in the last 2 weeks. We move on to this slide showing the elevated water levels, which have been an ongoing issue in the Great Lakes. This information comes from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Detroit District. So again, this is based off of the February 6-month forecast, which does forecast for the months between February and July. So this will be updated again at the beginning of March. So overall, Lake Ontario is the only lake that is back to near average water levels. All of the other lakes are expected to be below record high levels, but still well above average this year. So this is important because flooding of those inland streams and rivers will be slower than normal as they drain into the lakes. And some future storm systems that come through this spring may cause additional erosion and lakeshore flooding. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the weather and climate outlooks that are going to influence our river outlooks into the spring. So the biggest story this next week across the Mississippi Basin is more rain in the lower portions of the basin, and again through the Tennessee Valley and even southern portions of the Ohio Valley. So right now, a widespread 3 to 7 inches of rainfall is forecast through March 4th, as multiple waves of moisture are expected to push across the eastern U.S. So this will add additional moisture to the soils and at least temporarily elevate those stream flows and potentially cause some isolated flooding as well. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is monitoring the storage levels at the Yazoo River, which I highlighted earlier, as that bullseye rain is currently forecast to impact that basin. Now, if we move on to the week 2 outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, probabilities favor above normal temperatures across the northern plains and the majority of the Mississippi Basin in week 2. Probabilities also favor above normal precipitation in week 2 across the northern portions of the greater Mississippi Basin. So on the flip side, below normal precipitation is also favored to continue across the northwest portions of the greater Mississippi Basin. So unfortunately, not much drought relief is expected up there in week 2. And below normal precipitation is also favored for the lower Mississippi, which could be a relief after that rainfall that we saw on the last slide. Looking out further at the latest seasonal outlooks, taking us through May, probabilities favor above normal temperatures across the majority of the United States. As is common with a La Nina pattern, which we are in right now, probabilities also show that above normal precipitation chances are expected to shift north into portions of the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region as well. So this will be extremely important to watch, as those convective rainstorms, which you all know are typical in the greater Mississippi Basin in the springtime, can lead to flooding even if the overall risks are considered low. And finally, we're going to transition from our weather and climate outlooks into how this is all expected to impact the hydrologic outlooks for the spring. So on this slide, you can see a low to medium risk of widespread significant flooding is expected through May. Near normal to below normal flood risk exists for much of the basin, except for portions of the Ohio Basin and stretching back across northern Illinois and into eastern Iowa, where an above normal risk is present. Ultimately, the amount of snow available for melt and the frequency and intensity of additional springtime rainfall is going to determine the final outcome of the flood risk for this spring. It is important, as we saw earlier, to note that drier soils do have the potential to reduce the amount of runoff from the melting snowpack through the spring and thus reducing the spring flood risk. Now I'm going to pass it over to Jim Knoll, who will discuss the potential of flooding this spring across the Ohio River Basin.
All right, thank you, Katie, and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start off with talking about our current conditions if we move on to the next slide. And we'll be talking about, we showed this a couple weeks ago, about how even though winter started off quite dry, as Katie was showing, even in the Ohio Basin, there's areas of below normal precipitation for winter as a whole. But in the last 30 days, it has really changed. We've gotten much more active, especially along and south of the Ohio River, where we've had pretty widespread 3 to 6 inches of precipitation. So you see a lot of green showing up there now in West Virginia, Kentucky, southern Ohio, southern Indiana, and southern Illinois. So that green area of above normal precipitation continues to expand. Our types of soils in the Ohio Valley have pretty short-term memory with clay-type soils. So when they turn wet in this wintertime season where we don't have high evaporation and evapotranspiration rates, it doesn't take much in the upper soils to create an environment ripe for runoff. If we move on to the next slide, as Katie was talking about, on the 7-day, we still saw below normal stream flows across the northern Ohio Valley, but this is a 1-day USGS stream flow map, and it's a great map to use to kind of see where you have ice and snow still existing and where it's released. Much of Ohio and Indiana and even southeast and east central Illinois are turning greens and blues as that snowpack has released now. But you still do see orange areas of below normal stream flow in the upper Allegheny Basin and north of Pittsburgh there in western Pennsylvania, southwest New York, as well as across northern Ohio and northern Indiana. That is where we still have a snowpack left in that area, generally north of Highway 30 in Ohio and Indiana. And that snowpack continues to release. We expect it to continue to release into this weekend as temperatures warm up again after a little bit of a cool down today. We're also seeing some ice jam action being reported, especially in northern Ohio and on into northern and central Indiana. And that they're fairly minor events. We don't expect, significant issues with them, but we will see some minor ice jam action as the ice continues to break up and the snow melts off in the northern portion of our basin. The one exception where we may struggle to see that snowpack come off, which is typical, is way up in southwest New York, northwest Pennsylvania, and sometimes the highest of elevations in northern West Virginia. Sometimes that snowpack will hang on a little bit longer. We still do have several inches of water equivalent on the highest peaks of our mountains in northeastern West Virginia that does need to come off. If we move on to the next slide, then we're going to talk a little bit about the long-range outlooks, and then at the end we'll come back to our short-range outlooks. In terms of the longer-range outlooks, not much has changed since last week. We do expect widespread minor flooding here in the Ohio Valley into spring, with some moderate flooding expected, at least a 50% or greater probability in the lower Ohio Basin. Moving on to the next slide, but what's really important in the Ohio Valley, unlike some other areas of the country, is rainfall uncertainty dominates Ohio Valley flood risk. So it's really important for us to look at probabilities down around the 25 to 50% range as well, to give you a really good sense of what the real risk is in the Ohio Basin. And as you can see, there is the possibility of pretty widespread minor to moderate flooding across a good portion of our basin. And there could be a few pockets of major flooding extending from Kentucky back into southwest Indiana and southern Illinois as we move into spring. Again, if you look at this map overall, the possibility is the greatest risks exist in the southern half and the western half of the Ohio River Basin, and probably it looks like the lowest risks are in the upper Ohio Basin. If we move on to the next slide, now we're going to break down in more detail what we're expecting. Again, not much change from 2 weeks ago. We are expecting at least a 50% chance of minor flooding in the Maumee Basin in northeastern Indiana and along the Wabash Basin, extending from northern Indiana through western Indiana, as well as the East Fork of the White and most of the White River Basin in central Indiana and the Embarrass Basin in east central Illinois. There's also at least a 50% chance of minor to moderate flooding in the lower portion of those river systems, including the lower White, the lower Wabash, and the Little Wabash Basin. It should be noted, because of the current snowmelt, we have now ongoing flooding in the Little Wabash, as well as developing in the East Fork of the White Basin in Indiana. So we do have some flooding beginning to pop up, and that's currently just from snowmelt alone. Moving on to the next slide and dropping down into Kentucky and Tennessee, this is where our attention will be focusing over the next couple of weeks as an active storm track that Katie was talking about will be coming across the southern Ohio Valley and Cumberland Valley. Right now, we are expecting at least a 50% chance or greater of minor flooding across the Kentucky Basin, as well as the South Fork Kentucky Basin, the Green and Upper Cumberland Basins in Kentucky. It should be noted that when we look just a little bit lower, there is a 25 to 50% probability of moderate or greater flooding in the Kentucky, South Fork of the Kentucky, Elkhorn Creek, Green, Rough, Little Sandy, and Upper Cumberland Basins. So that encompasses a good portion of the state of Kentucky and could leak down into the state of Tennessee. If we move to the next slide and move up into Ohio and West Virginia, we continue to expect a 50% or greater probability of minor flooding in northwest Ohio along the Maumee River Basin, as well as the Muskingum and Killbuck Creek basins in central and east central Ohio, the Scioto Basin in central Ohio, and Ohio Brush Creek in south central southwestern Ohio. We also expect some Lake Erie shoreline flooding from the high water levels on Lake Erie this spring when we have windstorms coming out of the north. Further to the east in northern West Virginia, there's at least a 50% probability of minor flooding in the Cheat River Basin in West Virginia. Again, it should be noted there's at least a 25% or greater chance of moderate flooding in the St. Joe and Blanchard River in northwest Ohio and the Cheat and West Fork in northern West Virginia. Moving on to the next slide, we'll take a look at the Ohio River itself. We continue to expect at least a 50% probability of minor flooding below Louisville on the Ohio River into this spring, with a 25% or greater chance of minor flooding below Point Pleasant, West Virginia, along the Ohio River. Right now, we don't anticipate widespread moderate or major flooding on the Ohio River, but that still has a chance to change in the coming weeks. Moving on to the next slide, then, we're going to shift our attention then to finish up here with our short range outlook, as we do have upcoming weather systems. Over the next 10 days, our flood outlook map indicates the risk of at least minor to moderate flooding possibilities across West Virginia and Kentucky, possibly down into Tennessee, with the storm system that'll be approaching this weekend into early next week. Isolated major flooding is also possible in southeastern Kentucky. If we move on to the next slide, over the next 2 weeks, the rainfall is expected to range from about 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches north of the Ohio River, which is considered actually normal to slightly below normal. However, 2 to 5 inches of rain with possibly higher totals are expected to the south of the Ohio River, which is considered above normal, and yielding above normal flood risk in the short term to the south of the Ohio River. Moving on to the next slide, to bring this all together for the Ohio and Cumberland valleys, flood risk is considered above normal the next 60 to 90 days. This is driven by the outlook for above normal rainfall. Minor to moderate flooding is expected. This is really driven by the potential on a more of a widespread or frequent basis than a magnitude basis. So we're expecting we may have more frequent minor to moderate floods the next 60 to 90 days than normal. The peak of those floods may not be higher than normal. Moderate to isolated major flooding is possible, mainly south of the Ohio River. And again, this does not include the Ohio River, where currently we only expect some minor flooding. Lake Erie shoreline flooding is still elevated as Lake Erie remains quite high in the spring. And finally, the frequency, intensity, and extent of the rainfall will ultimately determine the final outcome of the flood risk in the spring in the Ohio and Cumberland basins. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike at the North Central River Forecast Center.
Thanks, Jim, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start out by laying the foundation for the flood risk across the North Central RFC area by taking a look at how dry our soil is. Katie already showed the Drought Monitor map, but I want to show it once more. As we've mentioned, the area continues to be very dry. A large portion of our service area is experiencing drought or abnormal dryness. The next slide is going to show water content in the snow that we do have on the ground right now. And here you can see a snapshot of the snow water content. The dryness generally prevails over the western areas where limited precipitation has occurred over the past 2 weeks. In the Hudson Bay drainage, including the Red River and the Souris rivers, there's very little water on the landscape as compared to normal. Even despite the snow that they had there on Tuesday, we did add a little bit more snow to the landscape in the last 2 weeks from Minnesota and Iowa over toward Michigan. And that added to the snow in that area of concern we talked about a couple weeks ago that runs from eastern Iowa to southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. That area still has an abnormally deep snow cover for this late in the season. And the latest water content in that band of snow is from 3 to about 4.5 inches. Of course, there's also a higher amount of snow across the Minnesota Arrowhead region, and especially the upper peninsula of Michigan. But that's pretty typical for those areas. And in fact, the snow is actually still below normal for this time of year in those spots. One other thing to note, the snow that we had over Missouri and the southern half of Illinois is now pretty much gone, thanks to the warm weather that we've had this week. And on the next slide, we're going to show the water content rankings as we compare them to our historical record depicted in our models. So the northern portions of our area continue to have very little water on the landscape and remain in the lowest 10% for any year in our records. That's noted by the red colors there, reds and oranges. Our main focus area remains the band of deeper snow we just talked about, and that runs from Iowa over toward Illinois and southern Wisconsin. In those areas, the amount of snow water is still ranked in the top 10% historically, so much more there than usual. But I just want to point out too that this particular graphic was generated early on February 22nd, and the warm weather we've had this week has melted pretty much all of the snow along and south of that yellow line. And in fact, on the next slide, I grabbed a satellite image from just this afternoon that shows kind of clearly where the snow is still on the ground. Now on the bottom part of that image, that is cloud cover that reaches from Kansas into Missouri, but pretty much the rest of the white you see on the image there is all snow cover. So you can see the snow line running along the Iowa and Missouri border region, cutting across the central part of Illinois. Snow still lingering across northern Indiana and into Ohio, where Jim was just talking about. You can also see out in South Dakota, almost no snow on the ground in pretty much the whole state, except for maybe out in the Black Hills and in the very northeast part of the state. And then North Dakota had that band of snow that occurred on Tuesday, and you can see that as a brighter white running from northwest to southeast across the state there. So let's take a look, moving on. All of the conditions that we're talking about here are borne out in our flood risk potential. As we see here in this slide, most of our area is not really anticipating much flooding. You can see that pretty much the northern half of our area doesn't have any kind of colored icons on it at all, indicating not much of a flood risk. Where flooding does have a greater than 50% chance of occurring, it appears that the most likely outcome is going to be of the minor flooding variety, and that's depicted by the orange icons there. And of the forecast points that we have in the North Central River Forecast Center, we have only about 100 or so that are indicating a greater than 50% chance of risk of any flooding. And only a very small number of those have a greater than 50% chance of exceeding the moderate or major flood stage. So the bottom line is here for our area, in general, we have a lower risk for widespread significant flooding when you compare it to a typical year. Our primary area of concern continues to be where that heavy snow band is. So let's zoom in on that on the next slide here. As you can see in this image, there's quite a few orange icons, as well as a few reds and one purple in there. So there is a risk for flooding in this area, at least a 50% chance for reaching flood stage. But again, most of the flooding, if it does occur, is expected to remain in the minor category. Some of the river systems that are more likely to be impacted by this flooding include the Rock and Illinois rivers, as well as the Mainstem Mississippi River, and of course, some of the smaller tributaries that feed into those. Next, I decided to include a look at the 25% chance for flooding, just like Jim did for his Ohio Basin. And this kind of further highlights our focus area. It shows that there's a 25% chance for seeing some flooding in the areas with the colored icons. It's much more widespread than a 50% chance. And there's also more icons that show the higher flood category. We have many more purples and reds in there that indicate the moderate and major levels. And that is kind of focused in those areas that have the heavy snow band that we talked about earlier. So this is the primary focus for flooding in our area. And those in those spots should be aware that although the most likely scenario is for minor flooding, we could go higher if we see increased precipitation. Moving on to the next slide, we'll talk about frost depth. The frost in the ground has now gone a little bit deeper since we took a look at this 2 weeks ago. We had that cold snap. In the Dakotas, with the limited snow cover to provide any protection from that deep cold, the frost depth has gone down to 2 to 4 feet now, and even more than that in some spots. But where we had the snow to separate the cold from the ground and provide a little blanket of insulation, the frost depth really didn't change too much. Frost depth right now is generally 1 to 2 feet in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Depth still only a foot or less for most of Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, and eastward into Indiana and lower Michigan. The depth of the frost penetration is important to our flood potential picture because when the frost is deep, it limits the amount of water that can infiltrate into the soil. If it can't soak in, it's going to run off into rivers. So with less frost in the soil, the chances are that the ground will thaw faster and more of the melt water will try to soak in rather than run off. So in general, that should lower our flood risk. One other thing that could impact some flooding is ice jams, and we'll take a look at that on the next slide. We had a mild winter up through the month of January, and that kept rivers open and ice-free for a much longer time than typical. Many rivers in our area typically ice over in December, but they were still running free all the way through about January 15th or January 20th. But then that deep cold set in, and that really enhanced our ice production. It also caused some freeze-up jamming in a few locations. The most notable spots have been along the St. Clair River, which is running along the international border north of Detroit. We had some jamming and continue to have jamming along the Wisconsin River near Portage, Wisconsin, and also in the Menominee River, which runs along the Wisconsin and Upper Peninsula border. As we move into warmer weather now, our attention is turning from freeze-up jams and going over to break-up jams. That's where the blocks of ice break free, and then they can get stuck in the rivers at bridges, sharp turns in the river, or other obstructions in the river channel. That does remain possible over the next few weeks as our breakup continues. Overall, I think our risk for ice jamming continues to be lower than in a typical melt season, but there still could be some, especially if we get a rapid river rise that can pop that ice free and allow the chunks to move downstream. All in all, I guess I'd categorize the threat as low to perhaps medium. So on the next slide, we'll summarize. In general, the risk for widespread flooding this spring appears to be less than normal for the north central RFC area. In places that do get some flooding, the most likely result looks to be of the minor variety. But as usual, and as has been mentioned, spring rains and how the temperatures play out, that's going to determine how the snowmelt rate and runoff timing will occur and affect our river flooding chances. And with that, I'll now pass it along to Kevin Lau, the Service Coordination Hydrologist at the Missouri Basin RFC in Kansas City.
All righty, thank you so much, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Mike says for his basin, I'll say the same thing. Flood risk for this spring remains below normal for the Missouri River Basin for spring 2021. And I'll try to illustrate this with this slide. It's a little complicated. The right-hand graphic is the probabilistic 90-day stage distribution for the Little Sioux River at Lynn Grove, Iowa. And it serves as an example of the departure or the gap between historical, the blue line, and today's condition, the black line. And so what this right-hand graph is attempting to show is that conditions on the ground today result in a decrease in the chance to reach minor flood stage at Lynn Grove of 39% as compared to normal or historic. Historically, Lynn Grove has roughly a 49% chance of hitting flood stage, but this year it has only a 10% chance. So, approximately a 40% decrease. On the map on the left, Lynn Grove would plot up as a dark blue dot. The colors on the map depicting the departure from historic for each of the 470 some odd forecast locations across the Missouri Basin. And so it can be seen on the left-hand map that locations can be found throughout the basin, having anywhere from a 10 to as much as a 30% decrease in flood potential. Now, mind you, there are a handful of locations, the little yellow dots you see sprinkled in the central portion there, that have anywhere from a 10 to a 30% increase in flood potential. So the blanket statement that the basin has an overall decrease in flood risk doesn't hold for each and every location in the basin, but it is a general trend. And so that's why we're saying that we have a reduced flood risk in the Missouri Basin. So let's look into details. Moving now to the mountains. The graphic that you see here is courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or the NRCS. It shows the mountainous basin snowpack condition and percent of average snow water equivalent, the amount of liquid that's held in the snowpack. And so mountain snowpack, we're saying, is being near average. By this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated about 80% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent in the mountainous areas. And so while things could still change, the 2021 mountain snowpack is coming into focus. Moving now to the next slide, our office issued its last or most recent water supply forecast at the first of the month, 1st of February. And that is graphically displayed in the left-hand side. And our last water supply forecast would suggest a below average mountain runoff year, volumetrically speaking, for the mountainous west. And that goes April through July. We did gain some snow in February, so I suspect that our March numbers that will be coming out in another week or so will be somewhat higher than those percentages you see there on this graph. But again, significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone is not expected in 2021. Moving from the mountains into the plains, as has already been said, and that was a pretty nice satellite imagery that Mike shared, the heaviest plains snowpack is to be found in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, where snow water equivalent, again, the liquid amount in the snowpack ranges from about a ½ an inch to as much as 2 inches. And this is depicted here in this graphic that's courtesy of the National Weather Service Office of Water Prediction. Otherwise, plains snowpack is negligible across the rest or the remainder of the Missouri Basin. Moving now to talk about river ice action, like Mike and Jim has already talked about, we do have to deal with ice. The basin has not been devoid river ice action this year. Freeze up ice jams have occurred along the Wind River in Wyoming, the lower Yellowstone and the Jefferson in Montana, the North Platte, the Platte, and the Niobrara rivers in Nebraska, just to name a few examples. Pictured here is a very unusual sight. It is the Missouri River at Jefferson City, Missouri. This picture, courtesy of the Usgs, was taken 2 days ago, just hours after an ice jam that had formed just upstream of Jeff City released. The Arctic blast that had gripped the basin for the past 2 weeks resulted in this jam, whose length exceeded 100 miles upstream of its head there at Jefferson City. As far as I know, ice jamming has not occurred downstream of Kansas City since the 1980s, so very unusual. Although flooding was not a primary concern with this particular jam, it did place water intake performance in the lower river in jeopardy for several days. However, we're not out of the woods yet. Although temperatures have begun to moderate, river ice conditions or concerns remain, especially in the lower basin. And going into March, with many of the lower basin rivers still iced up, is not a good thing. With March comes the possibility of quick warm-ups, which would lead to rapid snowmelt where plain snow does still exist or where it may form. March also brings with it the possibility of rainfall events. In fact, a more active weather pattern is being outlooked as we move into March. Runoff from either snowmelt or rain, with river ice still in place, could lead to river ice breakup and jamming. And so we need to remain vigilant for the next few weeks, especially in the Nebraska, Iowa area. The probabilistic outlooks that we develop and that I'll be discussing here in just a second does not take into account the added risk of river ice. And so now I'll go area by area, actually state by state, through the Missouri watershed, highlighting those areas where our long-range outlooks indicate a better than 50-50 chance of seeing flooding over the next 90 days. This is Nebraska, and as of right now, minor flooding is likely only along Wahoo Creek, shaded here in yellow in east central Nebraska. Moving eastward into Iowa, minor to possibly moderate flooding is anticipated along the Little Blue River, again highlighted in red here in northwest Iowa. Moving south and west into Kansas, moderate level flooding is likely along Stranger Creek, highlighted in red there in northeast Kansas, and the Little Osage River, located in red in southeast Kansas. Minor flooding is also expected along the Big Blue, Black Vermilion, and the Meredithine rivers, all shaded here in yellow. And finally, moving eastward into Missouri, the last state that I'll discuss, a very long list of rivers expecting to witness flooding this spring. And this is nothing new. This is all very typical for this time of year for these rivers. And as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, a few of these rivers have already seen a couple of rounds of flooding just in the latter part of January alone. And that January flooding here in Missouri reminds us that flooding can and does occur in the lower basin year-round. Finally, I wanted to break out the lower 800 miles of the Missouri River on a slide all its own. The Missouri River is expected to see minor flooding in the Rulo to Atchison reach, there above Kansas City, and then in the reach below Kansas City all the way to the mouth. And so, in summary, then, for the Missouri River Basin, spring flood risk is below normal for the basin. We did add a bit of mountain snow in February, and so we're now saying the mountain snowpack is near average. And we've still got about 20% of the accumulating season left, but we're getting a fairly good feel for what the mountain contributions to overall runoff will be this year. Flooding due to mountain snowmelt alone is not expected. Plain snowpack is, for all intents and purposes, non-existent, with the exception of eastern Nebraska and western Iowa. And again, we are losing much of that pack even today. The latest Drought Monitor puts 90% of the Missouri Basin in abnormally dry conditions or worse. Soils are cold, that's true, but they haven't frozen in place because soil moisture just isn't there. So we believe that frozen ground conditions will not play a factor in exacerbating runoff. Thunderstorm activity typically drives flooding in the lower basin, and so we are calling for episodic minor to even moderate flooding this spring across eastern Kansas and the state of Missouri. Going into March with river ice, which we are, is not a good thing. And I remain concerned with locations in the southern half of the basin that have the potential to see March warm-ups and March rains, either of which could give way to ice breakup jamming. Thank you. This concludes the flood potential brief for the Missouri Basin. And I'll now turn the presentation over to James in the Arkansas Red.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Not much has changed hydrologically in the Arkansas Red Basin in the last 2 weeks, but I'll briefly go over a few changes and the current conditions. Much of the basin did see a couple of rather impressive snowfalls, for our neck of the woods at least, during the recent record cold spell in the south central U.S., with snowfall totals ranging from about 5 to 15 inches. Snow water equivalents were generally less than 1 inch. So if you look at the percent of normal precipitation for the last 2 weeks, which this graphic shows, you can see most areas picked up below normal amounts of precipitation, the two notable exceptions being the Texas Panhandle and central Colorado. On the next slide, speaking of Colorado, we show the snow water equivalent as a percent of normal in the upper Arkansas River Basin as determined by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. This value has dropped between 5 to 10 percentage points in the last 2 weeks. And in this area, the snowpack typically reaches a max in the latter half of April. At this time, we don't expect snowpack to be a flooding issue later this spring. And in fact, with that, along with the persistent drought in this area, we are continuing to call for a below normal flood risk on the upper Arkansas River upstream of Pueblo. The next slide shows the status of the Corps and Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs in our basin with respect to the amount of flood storage used. If you recall, 2 weeks ago, we had several lakes using 10 to 15% of their respective flood storage in northeast Oklahoma. With the lack of significant precipitation, the lakes are now all either below their flood pools or using less than 5% of their flood storage. This bodes well for their ability to capture any future excess runoff and will help alleviate any possible flooding in the coming months. The next slide, the long-range forecast of rivers, shows those rivers having a 50% or greater chance of flooding. We still have about the same handful of rivers where our long-range models indicate a greater than 50% chance of flooding. These include the Neosho River and Bird Creek in northeast Oklahoma, the Illinois and Poto Rivers in eastern Oklahoma, the Little River in central Oklahoma, and the Fourche-Lafave River in central Arkansas. It should be noted that these rivers and areas are the typical ones that have a higher chance of flooding in any given spring, so it is not out of the ordinary. Finally, on my summary slide, we do have some rivers where we expect to see some spring flooding, but in general, we continue our outlook for a near normal flood potential across the Arkansas Red Basin. The lone exception is central Colorado, where we are expecting a below normal risk of flood in the Arkansas River system above Pueblo Lake. As a reminder, most of the spring flooding that occurs within the Arkansas Red Basin is driven by convective storm systems, which can occur over any portion of our watershed any time of the year. And with that, I'll pass it on to Jeff Grushel at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
All righty, thank you, James. As far as the Lower Mississippi River flood outlook, right now we're kind of looking at minor flooding still occurring right now over parts of Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana from previous rainfalls and a little bit of snow melt. We had 3 to 6 inches of rainfall that occurred over the lower parts of Louisiana and Mississippi over the last couple of weeks, and so those areas are still kind of recovering from some of the flooding that we had earlier. Also, we had pretty significant snowfall that occurred over Arkansas. It was pretty unusual with mounts up to 2 feet in some locations, and all that has melted though with the warmer weather that we've had here over the last several days. But that has allowed some of those, especially the top layer of the soil to be wetted up over parts of Missouri, Arkansas, western Tennessee, and northern Mississippi. So if we switch to the next slide and talk about the lower Mississippi River and the Chaffelai rivers, really no changes right now from what we had seen earlier, at least 2 weeks ago from the last outlook. The flows are actually running a little bit below normal right now, but as Katie and also Jim had showed some of the rainfall that we're anticipating here over the next week to 2 weeks or so, we do expect things to change a little bit, and we do anticipate that with that rainfall falling over the Tennessee and the Ohio valleys, we will get additional rises that will occur over the next several weeks. Right now, some of our long-range models are actually showing crest in the mid-March timeframe on the lower parts of the Ohio, with some locations on the lower Ohio reaching minor flooding. So right now, based on what we see at the moment, our potential is for minor flooding for this winter and spring on the lower Ohio, lower Mississippi, and the Chaffelai rivers. And on the next slide, we'll talk about the Arkansas and Missouri areas. As far as what we're seeing here, some of the, like I said, these areas received quite a bit of snow here over the last couple of weeks. All of this is melted. Right now, we only have minor flooding occurring on the Ouachita River at this time, although we are expecting some pretty decent rainfall to occur, especially in the southern portions of the state over the next 7 days. And this will probably cause renewed rises and probably renewed flooding over the Ouachita Basin. And potentially over the lower White Basin as well. So right now we're looking at minor to isolated moderate flooding as possible for the remainder of winter and spring for those locations. Switching slides and talking about Tennessee and northern Alabama, just like Arkansas, this area here is expected to receive some pretty heavy rainfall over the next week to week and a half. This will potentially cause some minor to some isolated moderate flooding in some of the smaller tributaries in Tennessee. And again, the potential for minor to isolated moderate flooding will continue over the next several months. Going a little bit further south into Louisiana and to Mississippi, over the past 2 weeks, this is the area that's really received the bulk of our heaviest rainfall over the last 2 weeks. And we are still dealing with a little bit of flooding on the Calcasieu and the Pearl River basins. And the Chickasawhay just went below flood stage today. But we are actually starting to forecast some minor flooding on parts of some of the tributaries in the Yazoo and the Big Black from the rainfall that we're anticipating just over the next couple of days. This rainfall probably will give us additional minor flooding and some isolated moderate flooding in places, especially in the northern parts of Mississippi and the Yazoo Basin, and potentially in the northern part of Louisiana and the Ouachita Basins. And as we extend further southward or so, that may trickle into a little bit into the Big Black and the Pearl Basins. The potential for minor flooding with isolated moderate flooding is possible for this winter and spring for those locations. So we'll go to our last slide here and talk about the summary. Right now, from a flood risk standpoint, we're characterizing as near normal. Just about every year we get minor to moderate flooding across our area, and that's kind of what we're seeing, at least right now, based on the conditions that we have at this moment. Minor flooding is going to be possible for the lower Mississippi and lower Ohio rivers, along with the Chaffelai Basin. And just like everybody else, being as far south as we are, rainfall is really the key to knowing what the final outcome will be of the flood risk for this winter and spring. And with that, I will turn it back over to Katie at the Water Center.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff, and to all of our presenters today. Before summarizing all of these great presentations for you all, I did want to remind everybody on the line to please ask us questions via the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will distribute those to the appropriate RFC or to the Water Center as your questions come in. So in conclusion, across the greater Mississippi River Basin, near normal to below normal flood risk exists, except for the above normal flood risk across portions of the Ohio River Basin and stretching back into northern Illinois and eastern Iowa. Although mountain snowpack is now near normal, as Kevin covered, significant flooding due to mountain snow runoff alone is not likely. However, as many of the river forecast centers highlighted, ice on rivers does remain a concern. And again, the amount of snowmelt and the frequency, intensity, and extent of the rainfall heading into spring here will ultimately determine the final outcome of the flood risk for the season. Just a reminder, our next External Partners webinar is 2 weeks from today at the same time on Thursday, March 11th. We're going to give you all a few seconds here to get your questions in if you have them. All right, we're not seeing any questions come in through the question box. So again, thank you for today's participation in today's webinar. This recording of the webinar will be distributed via an email. In this same group, again, we'll be providing an update to this outlook for the greater Mississippi Basin on March 11th at 2:30 p.m. Central Time. So invites and webinar information for how to register for that one will be emailed to you all soon. Thank you all so much and have a great afternoon.